Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We're going to be taking a look at a parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 20. It's a story of a vineyard owner who leased out his vineyard to some tenants, went away to a distant country, and expected to receive his share of the crop. So he sends 3 different servants to collect that crop, and we'll see what happens as the parable progresses. Depending upon the lectionary that you use, Luke 20 might not be the reading for this coming Sunday, but we're going to stick with that because the lectionary that I do follow has Luke 20. So hopefully we'll be back on track with all the lectionaries next week. What we're going to do is we're going to not only take a look at the parable, but as with all these videos, we're going to ask how the Old Testament background is going to enlighten our understanding of the parable, as well as what Jesus says after he tells the parable. It turns out that Isaiah 5 and Daniel chapter 2 and some other sections from Isaiah, as well as Psalm 118, each of these are going to help us to better understand the full message that Jesus is communicating. Because once we finish with the parable, Jesus makes a seemingly abrupt shift from talking about a vineyard and its fruit to talking about stones and cornerstones and rejected stones. And I think by the time that we finish the explanation, you'll understand why he makes that seemingly abrupt transition, but which actually flows rather smoothly when you're looking at it through Hebrew eyes. So we're going to begin actually by just taking a very quick look at the verses that precede the parable. This is going to be Luke 21 through 8, and we're doing that only so that we can see the context in which Jesus is speaking, because we need to know exactly who's in the crowd. Exactly who is Jesus directly addressing and who is he indirectly addressing? So just a quick glance here at these first few verses of Luke 20. Jesus was teaching, notice, the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, and the chief priest and the scribes with the elders come up to him. And they had this well-known debate about John the Baptist. Was his baptism from heaven or from man? And the religious leaders basically decide, well, we can't give him an answer because if we're honest, we're going to get in trouble. And if we say, well, that it was from God, he's going to ask us, why didn't you believe him? So they come to him and say, we don't know. And Jesus responds to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Now that's what immediately precedes what we're going to look at, beginning with verse 9. What's important is that you have basically 2 different groups. You've got the people, and they're going to be the ones that Jesus is speaking this parable to, because it's a warning to the people to create some distance, as it were, between themselves and the religious leaders, who are going to be represented by the tenants in this parable. But because the religious leaders are overhearing the parable that Jesus tells to the people, we'll see at the very end of this reading their reaction. In fact, their murderous plotting reaction when they realize that Jesus spoke this parable against them. So keep in mind those 2 groups of people as we begin with verse 9 of Luke chapter 20. Jesus began to tell the people, again, that's the addressee here, the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that, of course, of the various metaphors that are used for the people of God in the Old Testament, that of the vineyard is fairly dominant. So take a quick glance at a few of these. These are from Isaiah 5, from the Psalms, from Isaiah 27, from Jeremiah 2. And you see echoes of this also in Ezekiel 19, Hosea 10. And of course, Paul picks up the vine imagery in Romans chapter 11. Isaiah 5 we're going to return to, but notice it starts out, or not starts out, but applies the vineyard to the house of Israel, and the men of Judah being his pleasant planting. So Israel, Judah, they're the vineyard. In Psalm 80, we sing of how God brought a vine out of Egypt, and then he drives the nations out. He plants this, he clears the ground. And the psalm continues with this whole imagery in the next few verses. Isaiah 27 speaks of a pleasant vineyard, sings of this pleasant vineyard and how the Lord is its keeper and he waters it. Jeremiah 2 says the same thing. I planted you a choice vine, wholly of pure seed. So the vineyard imagery is fairly well known, and so as soon as Jesus began to tell the story about a vineyard, you can guarantee that his hearers are going to be understanding this and hearing this story with ears tuned to all those Old Testament accounts about Israel being like a vineyard. Now, also keep in mind that the tenants that the landowner in this particular parable leases this vineyard out to, that fits too with the Old Testament understanding of the people of God as tenants upon the Holy Land. Now, this is significant, and I think it's a point that is very often overlooked. So take a look at this verse from Leviticus 25:23. The land, this is God speaking, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, God says. The land is mine, and you, speaking of course to the Israelites, you are strangers and sojourners with me, implied with me on the land that I own. And we have this comment from Jacob Milgram in one of his Leviticus commentaries. He says, they, speaking to the Israelites, they are to keep in mind that the owner of the land is Yahweh, and that they are only resident aliens. That is, Yahweh is the landlord, and the Israelites are tenants. So throughout the history of the Old Testament, and of course into the first century as well, the Israelites were not, theologically speaking, the owners of the land. God owned the land. He was the landowner, and he allowed his people to live on that land, to grow crops on that land, and they paid him, as it were, part of their rental agreement as they brought various kinds of first fruits to the temple as their sacrifices. This is what they paid for the lease. But they themselves were tenants upon the land. Now, this is significant because, as we see in this parable that Jesus is telling, there are tenants as well. They don't own the vineyard. They are tenants who are to pay some of the crop to the owner. Now, let's move on to the next section. This is verses 10 through 12, and it's really the history of the Old Testament that's summarized in just these 3 verses. When the time came, he, that is the landowner, sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant. Maybe he waited till the next season. Maybe he sent him right away. We don't know, but he sent another servant. But they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Now, the first thing to notice is one of the Greek words here, kairos. So when the kairos came, when the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants. This particular word is, sometimes anyway, theologically freighted, refers to a critical time. Now, in application of this particular parable, we can say that when God sends a prophet, that is always a kairos, a critical time. Because, of course, what you have in each of these servants is a representation of the Old Testament prophets, not 3 specific prophets, but the prophets are often called the servants of the Lord. And so each of these servants is sent by God throughout the history of the Old Testament to, as it were, collect the rent. They are looking for that which is owed to God. Now, what do they find? Well, they find rejection. They find abuse. They find being wounded. They find being violently attacked. That's what they find, instead of a joyful giving back to the landowner of that which is owed him. So they're sent empty-handed back to him. Now, this is important as well. So the Greek there is kenos, empty-handed. It's used twice in these verses. Now, the issue here, I would argue, the issue here is not that you had a fruitless vineyard. You will find that sometimes in the commentaries where there wasn't enough crop, and so that's why they sent them empty-handed. I don't think that's what was meant at all. Rather, the issue was not that the vineyard was fruitless. No, the issue was a refusal to accept that the vineyard did not belong to them, but to God. They wanted to pretend like the vineyard was their property. They owned it. They didn't want to give any rent to the original owner, and as we'll see at the very end of the parable, they tried to seize it for themselves so that they could have it legally or really illegally. But that was their goal. They wanted to make sure that they were in charge. They were the ones who owned the land. They were, as it were, God. They were the owner. So that's the problem. That's the issue. Not that the vineyard was not producing enough fruit. Now back to the application of this, the meaning of this. How were the various servants of the Lord, the prophets, how were they treated? How were they received throughout the history of Israel? Well, just a real quick look will tell you not well, violently in most cases. Moses, for instance, was almost stoned more than once, and he was grumbled against repeatedly by the Israelites. Elijah, well, a death sentence hung over him. Isaiah, according to tradition anyway, was sawn in two. That's probably the reference in Hebrews chapter 11 to those who were sawn in two. Jeremiah, you can read all about his woes. He was in prison, and he was threatened with death. He was forced into exile. And then Zechariah, another prophet, was stoned to death. So that's how the servants that the landowner were received in the Old Testament. That is how the prophets were received throughout the history of the Old Testament. Rejection upon rejection upon rejection. And as we'll see, Christ, who comes as a prophetic kind of figure, but a greater prophet, of course, the last and the greatest of the prophets, he himself will experience this rejection as well, as we find out in the next few verses in the parable that Jesus tells. So this is 13 through 15. Then the owner of the vineyard said, after all these rejections of his servants, he said, what shall I do? He says, I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance may be ours. And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. First of all, this language of beloved son, it occurs 2 times in Luke's gospel. Here in Luke 20:13, and then back in the baptism narrative of Luke 3:22, when the Holy Spirit descended on Jesus in bodily form like a dove, and the voice came from heaven saying, you are my son, the beloved one, or you are my beloved son, with you I am well pleased. There's also a possible echo here of the language in Genesis 22, that famous story of when Abraham was commanded to take his son, his only son, whom he loves, Isaac, and to offer him up as a sacrifice. And notice that fits well with the parable, because Isaac is both what? He is the beloved son, and he is the heir as well. Now, you might be saying to yourself, what exactly is going through the mind of these tenants? How do they think that by killing the son, they will be able to take control of the land? Well, we're filling in the gaps here a bit, but my suspicion, along with that and many others, is that what's happening is that when the son shows up, they probably assume that his father has died. And now he is the sole owner. He is the heir to the property. Therefore, if they kill him, then they simply can take the property for themselves. And we do have evidence that this was done in some situations in ancient Israel, not in first century Israel. You had landowners who owned the land, but they lived somewhere else. Maybe they lived in one of the far-flung provinces of Rome, or wherever they were. They weren't close by. They weren't in Galilee. They weren't in Judea, and so they would lease this land out. So they didn't have a lot of contact directly with those people who were working the land. So these workers of the land probably assumed when the son showed up that the father had died, he was the only owner, and so if they could get rid of him, then they could simply seize the property for themselves. So, what do we know so far? First of all, Jesus tells the parable to the people, but his adversaries are also listening. We know that a man, who equals God here, gives a vineyard, which equals Israel, to tenants, who are the Israelites, and they're to exercise stewardship over it. Stewardship is a huge theme in this parable. They, that is the leadership, repeatedly reject the servants, that is the prophets, whom they treat violently. Jesus, as the greatest and last prophet, is also sent by the Father, his beloved Son, but him they also cast out of the vineyard. Possibly that's an allusion to Jesus dying outside the walls of Jerusalem. And they put him to death. So we might say that the history of the Old Testament is the history of his own people's war with God. Over and over, they reject the one that God sent to them. And God, you can really see his heart. He's revealing the fact that he doesn't want to give up on his people. He doesn't send them 1 or 2 or really even 3 prophets. Sometimes in the Old Testament, you'll have the image of God getting up early in the morning and sending them a prophet right away. Prophet after prophet, servant after servant, he sends to them because the Lord does not desire that any perish, but that all come to life. And so he sends these servants in order to call his people back to him. But by and large, what these servants receive is not only rejection, but violence. And then this perpetual, consistent rejection of God's servants is continued, perpetuated in the ministry of Jesus himself, where he, more than a prophet, the beloved Son, the Father's heir, is cast out of the vineyard and put to death. He's crucified so that he is ultimately rejected with an even greater rejection than all those servants who came before him. Now let's transition to see what happens after Jesus finishes this parable, the question that he asks and then turns around and answers. Verse 15. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, surely not. Now, if you happen to know Greek, me genoito is the Greek behind surely not. Interestingly, that's the only time that this phrase occurs in the Gospels. You might know it very well from Paul's writings, where it occurs multiple times. May it not be, or absolutely not, or may it never be so. It's usually the way it's translated, so surely not. So Jesus says, well, what's the owner going to do? Well, he's going to destroy those tenants. That's what he's going to do, and he's going to give it to others. And when the people respond, may it never be, or may this not happen, probably what they're talking about is multiple things. May this not happen to the servants. May this not happen to the beloved Son. And may this not happen to the tenants. But whatever their protestation might be, that is exactly what's going to happen. Now let's pause at this point and ask ourselves, what is the specific Old Testament background to the parable that Jesus tells? We find that it is another parable. It's a famous one from Isaiah chapter 5. So let's take a look at that, and we're going to compare and contrast the parable from Isaiah 5, told by Isaiah, with the parable in Luke chapter 20, told by Jesus. So here's how it reads in Isaiah chapter 5. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones. Notice the stones there. We're going to come back to that. He cleared it of stones, and he planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done for it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, and behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. And let's compare these two parables. First of all, the comparisons between Isaiah 5 and Luke 20. There's a connection here between the language of love or beloved. So let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. And then, of course, we have the language of beloved son in Luke 20. Also, the question that's asked. In Isaiah 5, what more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? And then in Luke 20, Jesus says, what then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? And then what about the owner? Well, in Isaiah 5, clearly the vineyard owner is the Lord of hosts. And there's reference, of course, to the owner of the vineyard in Luke 20, who obviously refers to God. And then 4, in both of these, there's bloodshed or murder. God looked for justice. In Hebrew, this is a famous wordplay. I looked for justice, mishpat, but behold, bloodshed, mispak. And then, of course, they threw the beloved son out of the vineyard and killed him. So there's many comparisons between these two, but also there are some contrasts which are interesting. The problem seems to be different in the two different parables. The problem in Isaiah 5 seems to be the kind of fruit that is produced. So the vineyard produced stink fruit, ba'ush in the Hebrew, instead of grapes. And then in Luke 20, the problem doesn't necessarily mean that the vineyard was not fruitful, but rather it was a refusal to acknowledge the owner of the vineyard and their ongoing rebellion against him. Now, we might characterize that as stink fruit as well, but it's a little bit different focus in the two parables. And most significantly, the outcome is different. In Isaiah 5, God says, I'm basically going to remove all the protection that the vineyard has so that it's going to be laid waste, devoured. Thorns and briars will grow there. No rain shall rain upon it. But it's very different in Luke 20, because here the vineyard's not going to be destroyed. Instead, the tenants are going to be destroyed, and the vineyard is going to be given to others. So that's the parable. That's the application, we might say, the quick interpretation, but there's more to come. Because what's going to happen now in these next few verses is Jesus is going to transition from talking about the vineyard to talking about stones by means of several different biblical texts that he brings together in a single citation. So let's look at the next few verses. This is 17 and 18. But he looked directly at them and said, What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. First of all, a couple of the Greek words here are worth taking a look at. Where it's translated there that he looked directly at them, that Greek verb is emblepo. It means more than just look. It has an intensification to it, like looking directly, looking intensely, looking right in someone's face. It's the same verb that Luke also uses in 22:61 to talk about how the Lord Jesus turned and looked at Peter after Peter had denied him. So this isn't just a glance, isn't just a look, but it's a very intense, direct look from one person to another. That's what happens here when Jesus tells the parable. So he's locking eyes with them. He's making sure they get it when he gives these biblical citations. Now, the other verb is apodokimazo, and this occurs 3 different times in Luke's gospel. It's the verb that means to reject. Now, this one is significant because in Luke 20, in the story of the parables, Jesus then quotes this. He says, the stone that the builders rejected, apodokimazo, the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Now, that is the same verb that's used in 2 different places in Luke's gospel to describe the rejection of the Son of Man. Luke 9:22, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected. Luke 17:25, but first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. So the theme of rejection, of course, is strong in this particular parable. They rejected the beloved Son sent to them, just like this stone is to be rejected. So, why do we have this seemingly abrupt shift from images of a vineyard all of a sudden to stones? Well, let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, there's probably a word play that's going on here. The word for son in Hebrew is ben, and the word for stone is eben. And there's, of course, very similar sound, very similar spelling between these two. And this wordplay between ben and eben, between son and stone, was common in rabbinic literature. It's hinted at a few times in the Old Testament as well, where, for instance, stones or precious stones are representative of the sons of Israel. So Jesus thus moves from talking about the rejected ben, the rejected son, to the rejected eben, the rejected stone. Secondly, the biblical text that Jesus was teaching from, Isaiah 5, that parable, refers to the removal of the stones. I pointed that out when I was reading through Isaiah 5, thus leading to the discussion of this stone. That's very common in Jewish teaching, to take one word or one phrase out of the text that's being preached on and to build upon that. That seems to be what's happening here when Jesus teaches on Isaiah 5. And the way that Jesus does this is pretty typical of later Jewish teaching, which also was probably reflective of what was happening in the first century as well, where a typical rabbinic interpretation or midrash would go from the biblical text, which in our case is Isaiah 5, to the exposition, which in our case is the parable that Jesus tells, to other biblical texts that were related in theme or language. And of course, here we have the themes of rejection, we have the language of stones, and we have the imagery of bloodshed as well. So let's take a look at these biblical texts that Jesus is referring to. One is from the Psalms, one is from Isaiah, and one is from Daniel. Jesus pulls them all together, and this was pretty common in the way that rabbis would interpret the scriptures. If there was a connection of language, we see this in Paul's writing as well. If there's a connection between two verses where they have the same language that are used, the same words that are used, they would often put these together, even though on the surface they might not be necessarily reflective of each other. If they had the same kind of language, they would often be put side by side and interpreted together. Same thing is happening here with the image and the language of stones. So, Jesus says, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. And so Jesus is alluding to or quoting from three different places. Psalm 118, verse 22, which is quoted more than once in the New Testament. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And then also Daniel 2, a famous section where you have, of course, that great statue which is representative of the world empires. And then you have a stone which was cut out by no human hand, and it struck this image on its feet of iron and clay, broke them in pieces. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is a picture of the stone that becomes the kingdom of God. And then finally, Isaiah 8, 14 and 15 says, He, that is God, will become a sanctuary, that is a sanctuary to those who trust in him, but also a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken. They may be snared and taken. Later rabbinic literature would use the image of a pot. So a pot which falls upon a stone, or if a stone falls upon it, either way, the pot is broken. That seems to be the same image that Jesus is using here as well. Whoever falls on the stone like a pot will be broken to pieces, and if it falls on anyone, like it falls on a pot, it will crush him. So Jesus is pulling together these sections from Daniel and Isaiah and the Psalms to talk about how he is the rejected stone who has been chosen by God. He is the one rejected by the religious leadership, but appointed by God to be it can be either the cornerstone or the capstone. Scholars disagree on which stone is meant, but either way, the important stone that holds everything together. Now, we have one quick section to look at the very end. We'll see how this was received by the religious leadership, and then we'll summarize the entire section. So Luke 20:19 through 20 says, the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour. Why? For they perceived that he had told this parable against them. They knew that they were the subject. But they feared the people, so they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So, he addressed the parable to the people, but the others who were listening perceived that it was spoken against them. And so, with murderous premeditation, they decided they were going to do whatever was necessary to put him to death. In other words, fulfilling the exact same actions that their forefathers had done in rejecting the prophets that God had sent to them. Let's pull all of this together and see what we've learned. First, the leadership of Israel would be taken from the current religious leaders, like the scribes and the temple leadership, and given to the apostles as leaders of the expanding Israel of God. Now, this is not replacement. The church does not replace Israel. Rather, the church is Israel continued and expanded, where you have more and more of the Gentiles, along with Jews, included in the Israel of God. So, now, no longer is the Israel going to be led by the temple leadership and the Sadducees and whoever. It's going to be led by the apostles and the preachers of the Israel of God, the Christian church. Secondly, their rejection of the Son was sadly consistent with their ongoing rejection of God and his prophets. Servant after servant was rejected by the tenants. And then, ironically, their rejection was the means whereby Jesus as Messiah was manifest, since the Father made him the cornerstone of the church. So their rejection of the Messiah was the Father's way of showing his acceptance of Jesus and his placement of him as that cornerstone of the church. So ultimately, what matters? What matters is the rejection or the acceptance by faith of Jesus as the rock, the sun, and the air. So in this parable that Jesus tells to the people, he's warning them. It is a warning parable to steer clear of the religious leadership, the tenants, because of what they're doing to the servants and what they will do to the beloved Son. And then to see him as the stone that God has chosen, the beloved Son that he has sent, the one in whom is our salvation, the one who is our sanctuary, so that by faith, accepting him, receiving him as the one that God has sent, instead of being crushed, we will become those who are found in him as the sanctuary of grace and mercy. So that's the parable. I hope it's proved helpful and hope that you're all doing well. We will see you next week as we continue to look at the Gospels through Hebrew.